Silent nights, shocking revelations, meeting the brother he never knew, and his wife's suspicious reaction. Can the quiet charm of a Holiday Inn mask the hidden cracks beneath a family's carefully tended facade? Before we get into this juicy tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss any future videos. Christian sacrificed his own ambitions and comfort aside to carry on the family legacy in Colorado. But as a stranger named Darius arrives in the midst of the season's celebrations, the delicate trust inside these timber and stone walls is upended. Christian's wife Sierra wrestles with a secret that could break his heart, while the new man in their life carries his own quiet claims on this family's history. Welcome back to Will I Be Happy, the channel where each hushed conversation, each guarded glance, risks fraying the threads that hold their world together. I'm your narrator, and with soft snow piling up outside and Christmas almost here, one question lingers. Will this holiday bring the long-needed honesty and forgiveness that restores their bond, or reveal truths that no amount of glittering decor and hot cocoa can make right? We'll see about that. The snow fell steadily over Beaver Creek, Colorado, cloaking the town in a soft, white haze. The Noel Inn stood like a sentinel against the mountains, its weathered stone walls and timber beams wrapped in a timeless charm that hinted at countless Christmases past. Lights twinkled in the windows, casting a warm, inviting glow into the storm. Outside, Christian Noel worked with quiet determination, the sharp air stinging his lungs as he cleared the steps leading to the inn's entrance. His breath rose in rhythmic puffs, curling in the icy air, while his muscular arms moved with practiced ease. Shoveling snow had become as automatic as breathing, but Christian's mind was miles away. He worked, but his thoughts drifted to a dream that now seemed as distant as the surfboards he used to imagine himself riding. Years ago, before the weight of responsibility settled over his shoulders like a leaden cloak, Christian had pictured a different life. He'd seen himself teaching tourists how to surf on the beaches of California, the ocean breeze a constant companion. But that dream had been swallowed whole the day his parents' car slid off a mountain road, leaving him as the keeper of their legacy. The inn had become his life, its creaking halls both a comfort and a chain. He paused for a moment, leaning on the handle of the shovel, and glanced up at the swirling storm. For a fleeting second, the wind carried a scent, briny, salty, like the ocean he'd never reached. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and snow. "Barry, stop running!" Christian's voice broke through his reverie, sharp with concern. His 5-year-old son dashed across the icy porch, boots skidding dangerously close to the edge. Sierra appeared moments later, her auburn ponytail swishing as she followed him, bundled in a thick coat and scarf. She looked younger than her 32 years in that moment, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright with exasperation and amusement. "I'll catch him!" Christian called, tossing the shovel aside. He swooped Barry up just as the boy lost his footing, earning a squeal of laughter that made Christian smile despite himself. He held Barry above his head for a moment, spinning him around until the boy's giggles became infectious. Sierra watched them with a faint smile, but as Christian set Barry down, her expression shifted, softened into something unreadable. She turned and walked back toward the inn, and for a moment, Christian found himself watching her instead of the snow. Her thick coat didn't hide the sway of her hips, nor the way her boots left precise, delicate imprints in the fresh snow. Something about the way she moved felt different. Not wrong, but not quite the same either. Too familiar and too far all at once. Christian shook his head, clearing the thought, and followed her inside. Inside the inn, warmth filled every corner. The scent of pine mingled with cinnamon and cloves, carried on the crackle of the fireplace in the lounge. A tall Christmas tree dominated the room, its ornaments glinting softly under twinkling lights. Barry and Ginger, Sierra's niece, who was staying with them for the holidays, played near the fire, their laughter a soothing hum in the background. Sierra stood at the reception desk, one hand on the phone, her voice low and lilting as she spoke to a guest. Her fingers drummed absently on the counter, her gaze distant, but when she caught sight of Christian, she smiled. Or, at least, she tried to. It was the kind of smile he'd come to know too well, polished, practiced, something to hide behind. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. They had been married for 7 years, but lately, the familiarity they once shared had been replaced by something brittle. Christian couldn't say when it had started. Maybe after Barry was born, maybe when the endless demands of running the inn began to wear on them, but he could feel it. Sierra didn't look at him the same way she used to, and when she did, it was often with something buried beneath the surface. Guilt? Resentment? He wasn't sure. As she hung up the phone, she glanced at him, her lips curving into a wry smile. "You know, the plumbing's about to go to hell. That kitchen sink won't last the week." Christian groaned, rubbing a hand over his face. "I posted an ad for a handyman last week. We'll see if anyone shows up." Sierra's eyebrow arched, and that teasing, almost too knowing smile played on her lips again. "You could always hire someone without turning it into a personal crusade, you know." Christian chuckled, though he felt the sting of her words. "I've been fixing this place for years. The sink's just another project." "You haven't fixed the sink," she pointed out, her tone playful but pointed. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, Christian felt the air between them shift. It wasn't a fight, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the kind of tension that simmered in quiet spaces, the kind that spoke of things unsaid. He cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Fine, you're the boss," he muttered, turning away before she could see the flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Later that evening, the storm thickened, casting the world outside into a blur of white. Christian stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, the rhythmic motion grounding him. Cooking was one of the few things that still made him feel in control, as if he could create order in the chaos of his life. The scent of rosemary and thyme filled the kitchen, blending with the crackling fire from the lounge. The sound of the front door opening made him pause. He wasn't expecting anyone. Turning, he saw a tall, broad-shouldered figure step inside. Snow clung to the man's coat and hair, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Christian's first thought was that he belonged in a glossy magazine, not in the middle of a snowstorm, looking for work. His second thought was that the man was watching him too closely. "Christian Noel?" the man asked, his voice smooth but with a quiet edge. He shrugged off his coat, revealing a fitted shirt stretched across his chest and forearms that looked like they could bend steel. "I'm Darius Avery. Saw your ad for a general worker." Christian stared, thrown off by the man's presence. "You came in this storm?" Darius's smile was slow, almost lazy. "When you're looking for something, you don't let a little snow stop you." Before Christian could respond, Sierra entered the room. She stopped mid-step, her lips parting slightly as her eyes locked onto Darius. For a moment, something unreadable flickered across her face. Christian's stomach tightened. Darius turned his gaze to her, his smile sharpening. "And you must be Mrs. Noel." Christian's chest tightened further at the way Darius's gaze lingered. Not overtly inappropriate, but unmistakably interested. Sierra tilted her head, recovering quickly. "We'll see if you're as good as you look," she said, her tone playful but edged with something Christian couldn't quite place. Christian extended a hand toward Darius, his grip firm. "We'll see how you do. I'll show you to your room." As Darius followed Christian up the stairs, his words lingered in the air. "Don't worry, I always fit right in." That night, as Christian sat alone in his office, the storm continued to rage outside. He stared at the swirling snow through the window, his thoughts tangled. Darius's arrival had unsettled something deep within him, not just because of the man's confidence, but because of the way Sierra had looked at him. Something had shifted, and Christian couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had only just begun. Just a few days before Christmas, snow fell relentlessly outside the Noel Inn, each flake landing softly on the thick blanket that had already swallowed the town. Inside the rustic kitchen, Christian sat alone at the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. The mug was warm against his palms, but the heat didn't seem to reach him. His gaze lingered on the swirling snow, but his thoughts were rooted firmly inside the inn, on the man currently occupying one of its guest rooms, Darius Avery. Christian hadn't been able to shake the feeling of familiarity since the moment Darius walked through the door. It wasn't just the resemblance, those sharp, piercing blue eyes that mirrored his own, the slight curve of his jawline that echoed the family photographs hanging in the hallway. No, it was something deeper, a sense of connection Chris couldn't quite place. And then there was Sierra. She had been acting differently ever since Darius arrived. It wasn't obvious, just a few seconds too long of holding his gaze, a hesitation in her laughter. Christian tried to tell himself it was nothing, but the knot of unease in his chest refused to loosen. Christian's jaw clenched as he set his mug down with more force than necessary. There was something about Darius, something that felt off, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong space, and Christian wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Darius had quietly retreated to his room after finishing up his chores for the day. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. His blonde hair was damp from the shower, his white t-shirt clinging faintly to the lines of his chest. He stared out the window at the swirling storm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here by accident. The Noel Inn wasn't just another place to work. It was the epicenter of everything that had been stolen from him. Darius had grown up far from the mountains, raised by a father who had done his best despite the weight of their circumstances. His mother, their mother, had been too young, 18 when she had him, still trying to figure out who she was and where she belonged. She had loved his father once, Darius knew that much, but their love had burned out quickly, leaving her alone with a baby and a life that felt too small for her dreams. When she met Christian's father, everything changed. The whirlwind romance swept her into a new world of stability, respectability, and family. But there was no room in that picture-perfect life for Darius. Christian's parents had made the only choice they felt they could. They supported Darius and his struggling father financially, but kept him at a distance, far enough that no one would ever question the quiet arrangement. Darius had grown up knowing his mom was alive, though never knew the full extent of the Noel family's involvement until his mother's death. It had been the first time Darius had pieced it all together, and it hadn't come easy. When Christian's parents had passed away, it had felt like the last thread holding them together had snapped. But the sense of abandonment he felt, the aching question of who he was and where he belonged, drove him to finally act. Now, at 39, Darius wasn't here to beg for scraps of belonging. He was here to stake a claim on the life he should have had, and he wasn't leaving until he got what he wanted. The early winter sun streamed through the frost-covered windows of the inn's kitchen, casting golden light across the polished countertops. Sierra stood at the island, her hands busy shaping cookie dough, but her mind was far from the task at hand. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air, but it wasn't enough to chase away the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. The steady rhythm of her rolling pin faltered when she glanced out the window. There he was, Darius, clearing the snow from the path with that effortless strength she couldn't ignore. His jacket hung open, revealing the toned lines of his chest beneath a fitted thermal shirt, damp with sweat despite the cold. The way he moved, precise, deliberate, powerful, set her nerves alight. Sierra's breath hitched as she quickly turned her gaze back to the dough, willing herself to focus. She pressed the cookie cutter harder than necessary, but the stubborn memory of his hands, his lips, his touch, lingered just beneath the surface. The sound of the front door opening startled her. Before she could look up, Mindy's familiar voice rang out, cheerful and brimming with energy. She was her longtime best friend, breezing in with her usual energy. "Hey! Hey!" Mindy called, her curls bouncing as she stepped inside. Snowflakes clung to her dark coat, and she stomped her boots to shake them off before tossing her bag onto the counter. "Am I late to the baking party, or just fashionably on time?" Sierra forced a smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "Right on time, as usual." Mindy grinned and leaned in for a quick hug, her signature scent of jasmine and vanilla filling the air. "God, it's freezing out there," she said, shivering dramatically. "But nothing like a good snowstorm to make the holidays feel authentic." You're here early, Sierra said, trying to keep her voice light. Everything okay? Better than okay, Mindy replied, her eyes sparkling with mischief as she glanced around. You know me, can't sit still when there's holiday magic to stir up, and maybe a little gossip to dig up while I'm at it. Before Sierra could respond, Mindy's attention shifted to the window. She stilled, her expression changing as she caught sight of Darius outside. Well, 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 Mindy said under her breath, her tone dropping into something between intrigue and amusement. She took a step closer to the glass, tilting her head. Sierra, who is that? And why didn't you tell me you had a walking snowstorm fantasy working for you? Sierra's stomach twisted into a tight knot. She tried to keep her voice casual. That's Darius. He's helping out around the inn. Darius, Mindy repeated, letting the name roll off her tongue like she was tasting it. As in Mr. Tall, Blonde, and Brooding over there? Jesus, Sierra, he looks like he stepped out of one of those steamy mountain romance novels you pretend you don't read. Sierra let out a shaky laugh, focusing intently on the cookies. He's just here for the job, Mindy. That's all. Just the job? Mindy's grin widened as she turned back to the window, openly ogling Darius as he lifted a heavy shovelful of snow. His muscles flexed beneath his shirt, and Mindy fanned herself theatrically. I don't know, girl. If that's just a job, I'm applying for it. Mindy, Sierra said sharply, her tone unsteady. Mindy turned, her eyebrows arching at Sierra's clipped tone. Whoa, what's with the ice? You've got that deer-in-the-headlights look, and not in a cute way. Sierra shook her head, trying to steady her breathing. It's nothing, just a lot going on. Mindy crossed her arms, her sharp gaze flicking back to Darius and then to Sierra. Her grin softened into something more knowing. Sierra, she said, her voice dropping conspiratorially. What aren't you telling me? Sierra froze. Her heart raced as she debated deflecting, but the weight of her secret was too heavy. She turned back to Mindy, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Mindy, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell anyone, especially Chris. Mindy frowned, her teasing demeanor fading into genuine concern. Okay, you're scaring me. Spill. Mindy crossed her arms, her sharp gaze flicking back to Darius and then to Sierra. Her grin softened into something more knowing. Sierra, she said, her voice dropping conspiratorially. What aren't you telling me? Sierra froze. Her heart raced as she debated deflecting, but the weight of her secret was too heavy. She turned back to Mindy, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Mindy, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell anyone, especially Chris. Mindy frowned, her teasing demeanor fading into genuine concern. Okay, you're scaring me. Spill. Sierra hesitated, her stomach twisting painfully. Then, in a rush, she said, I slept with him. Mindy blinked, stunned. I'm sorry, what? You slept with... She gestured wildly toward the window, her voice rising in disbelief. Him? Darius? It was before the wedding, Sierra said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. One night, a few days before the event. I didn't know who he was. I didn't even know his name. Mindy stared at her, her jaw slack. Sierra, what the actual hell? I was scared, Sierra admitted, tears welling in her eyes. I was about to marry Chris, and I didn't know if I was ready. I didn't know if I could do it. And Darius was just there, and it happened. Sierra nodded, her face burning with embarrassment. It was a mistake, Mindy, a huge one, but I didn't know what I wanted. I wasn't sure about Chris, and I needed to feel something before making that commitment. It wasn't planned. I was confused, and it was just one night. But after that, I knew. I knew I had to marry Chris. I love him, but I've never told him. I couldn't. If he finds out, it'll break him. Mindy let out a low whistle, leaning back against the counter. Jesus Christ, Sierra, that's a lot. And now he's here? Under the same roof as Chris? Sierra nodded, her hands trembling. I didn't know he was coming. He just showed up. And now I don't know what to do. If Chris finds out... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Mindy placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. You've got to handle this, Sierra. This isn't just going to go away. And if Darius is even half as dangerous as he looks, this could get messy real fast. Sierra shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. I know, but I can't let Chris find out. I just can't. Mindy stepped closer, her tone a little more somber. It's not going to be easy, but you need to talk to him before it all blows up in your face. I won't tell him, but you're running out of time, Sierra. Outside, Darius paused in his work, leaning against the shovel as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The cold air stung his skin, but he barely noticed. His gaze flicked to the kitchen window, where he'd caught a glimpse of Sierra and her friend. For now, he was just here for the job. But soon enough, he'd learn that family secrets couldn't stay buried forever. He smiled faintly, the expression sharp and knowing. Secrets always found their way to the surface, and this one was no exception. That afternoon, Sierra's heart pounded as she entered the inn's living room, her steps hesitant, her chest tight with the weight of what she knew she'd find. Darius was there, leaning casually against the fireplace mantel. The golden firelight danced over his features, casting deep shadows across his chiseled jawline and high cheekbones. He looked completely at ease, too at ease. His posture radiated confidence, as though he belonged here, as though he owned the space. Her space, her life, a life she had carefully built, carefully protected, until now. He turned his head when she stepped inside, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with unnerving intensity. For a moment, Sierra faltered, the memory of his hands on her skin flashing vividly in her mind. She clenched her fists, willing herself to push the image away. "What are you really here for, Darius?" she said, her voice sharper than she intended. She stopped a few feet from him, her arms crossing over her chest in a defensive posture. "Don't play games with me." Darius straightened, taking a slow step away from the mantel. The flames behind him seemed to flicker in response, casting him in a halo of gold and shadow. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, one that sent a ripple of unease down her spine. "Games?" he repeated, his tone light, teasing. "You think I came here to play games, Sierra?" She stiffened, the rising panic in her chest tightening her voice. "I think you came here to ruin my family," she said, her words clipped and icy. "What? Are you planning to tell Chris about that night? About us?" The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending unseen ripples through the air. Darius's smile deepened, slow and deliberate. He tilted his head, watching her with an almost predatory calm. "Us?" he said softly, his voice dipping low, intimate. "I don't think I came here for that, Sierra, but I see it's what's on your mind." He stepped closer, the flickering firelight catching in his eyes, and his tone softened, almost tender, but not without a bite. "Relax, Sierra. That night, it was nothing. A moment that doesn't matter now. I'm not here to relive the past. I'm here to remind you that secrets like yours never stay buried for long." She took a step back, but the space between them felt too small. He moved closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make her feel the heat of him, to make her pulse race. "You don't get to walk in here and make my husband's life a mess just because you feel like it," she snapped, her voice rising with the frustration that masked her fear. His lips twitched, and the amusement in his gaze darkened into something heavier, something almost dangerous. "Mess?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mock innocence. "I'm not here for a mess, but I am here to make sure you don't get too comfortable in that pretty little bubble of yours, Sierra." He took another step forward, and she could feel the heat of the fire at her back, the weight of his presence pressing against her. "Secrets have a way of coming to light," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed in her ears. "You know that as well as I do." Her breath hitched, and her fingers dug into her arms as she crossed them tighter over her chest. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't you dare tell him. Don't ruin everything." For a moment, he didn't respond. He simply stood there watching her, his gaze unyielding, piercing. Then he leaned in, just enough for her to catch the faint scent of him, clean, woodsy, faintly intoxicating. "Sierra," he said softly, his voice a dangerous caress. "It doesn't matter if I tell him. The truth always comes out, one way or another." Her chest heaved as she fought for composure, her mind racing with what he might do. Before she could respond, he turned away, his movement deliberate, almost dismissive. "I'll make sure to let Chris know what he's been missing," he said over his shoulder, his tone casual yet laced with a finality that sent ice through her veins. "Darius!" she called after him, her voice desperate. But he didn't stop. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sierra sank onto the edge of the sofa, her hands trembling. This was it. Everything she had worked so hard to protect was about to shatter, and she was powerless to stop it. Upstairs, Christian was seated at his desk, his brow furrowed as he scanned through a stack of invoices. The warm glow of the Christmas lights outside filtered through the window, casting soft patterns on the walls. But the festive atmosphere did little to lighten the weight pressing down on him. The inn, the holidays, the constant demands, it was all piling up. The knock at the door was soft but deliberate. Chris looked up, expecting Sierra or perhaps one of the staff. "Come in," he called, setting his pen down. When the door opened and Darius stepped inside, Chris's gut twisted. There was something in the way Darius moved. Calm, confident, like a man with nothing to lose. Chris straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" he asked, his tone cautious. Darius shut the door behind him, leaning against it briefly before stepping further into the room. He rested his hands on the back of the chair opposite Chris, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. "We need to talk," Darius said, his voice smooth, measured. Chris frowned. "About what?" "About family," Darius replied. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable, his tone heavy with meaning. Chris felt his pulse quicken, unease prickling at the back of his neck. "What about family?" he asked warily. Darius held his gaze, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched, taut and charged. Then he spoke, his words deliberate, unflinching. "I'm your brother, Christian," he said evenly. "Same mother, different father. She kept me a secret, but it's time you knew." The words hit Chris like a blow. His chest tightened, his breath caught. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "What?" he spat, his voice rising. No, that's not possible. That's not—" "It's the truth," Darius interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. "You've felt it, haven't you? The resemblance, the connection. I'm not just some stranger." Christian shook his head, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced, thoughts spiraling. "My mother, she would have told me. She wouldn't have kept something like this from me." "She did what she thought was best," Darius replied. "But that doesn't change the fact that I exist, that I'm your brother." Chris's hands clenched into fists, his anger rising to mask the confusion and hurt swirling inside him. "You don't just get to walk into my life and rewrite everything," he said, his voice sharp. "My family, my life, has been one thing, and now you come in here and tell me it's all a lie?" Darius's gaze softened, just a fraction. "I'm not here to rewrite anything," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a bitterness that couldn't quite be masked. "I'm here to tell you the truth about the mother who chose one son and left the other behind, a choice that shaped both our lives in ways neither of us asked for." Chris stared at him, his chest heaving, his thoughts a whirlwind. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on both of them. Finally, Christian shook his head, his voice trembling. "You can't just drop this on me. Not now. Not like this." Darius held his ground, his expression steady. "The truth doesn't wait for the right time, Chris. It just is." Chris sank back into his chair, his head falling into his hands. The weight of Darius's words pressed down on him, making the room feel stifling. His mother, his rock, the foundation of so much of his life, had kept this from him. His hands slid down his face as he struggled to process it. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice tight and raw. "Long enough," Darius said evenly, his calm tone a sharp contrast to the chaos swirling inside Chris. Chris's jaw clenched as he looked up, anger breaking through the confusion. You don't just get to show up here and drop this on me. You think you can waltz in, blow up my life, and expect what? Gratitude? A hug? Get out." Darius raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Chris! Out!" Chris barked, standing abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His voice rang through the room, his finger pointed sharply at the door. For a long moment, Darius didn't move. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he stepped back toward the door. His hand lingered on the knob, and he glanced over his shoulder. "The truth doesn't go away just because you don't want to hear it. I'll be around when you're ready to face it." The door clicked shut behind him, and Chris sank back into his chair again, his elbows resting on the desk. He exhaled a shaky breath, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. The room felt quieter, but the weight of what had just happened didn't lift. Downstairs, Sierra paced the length of the living room, her mind in turmoil. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. She had no idea what Darius was telling Chris, but the weight of it pressed against her like a vice. She stopped by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. The twinkling lights outside seemed mocking now, a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside her home. Sierra wrapped her arms around herself, her breath shaky. This was it. The truth she'd fought so hard to bury was clawing its way to the surface, and she didn't know how to stop it. It was the night before Christmas Eve, and the Noel Inn gleamed with festive charm. Golden lights framed the frosted windows, casting a warm glow onto the snow-draped yard. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner of the living room, each ornament catching the flickering light of the fireplace. Yet inside, the holiday cheer felt like a cruel mockery of the tension gripping the house. Sierra stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and drawn, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes betraying the turmoil she fought to contain. Her jaw clenched as she watched the snow swirl in the dark, her breaths shallow. She had spent days trying to hold everything together, but the threads of her carefully constructed life were unraveling faster than she could repair them. The faint sound of footsteps behind her made her tense. She turned slowly, already knowing who it was. Christian stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest, his shoulders rigid. The firelight cast deep shadows over his face, accentuating the storm in his eyes. His gaze was locked on her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Chris broke the silence, his voice low but sharp with restrained frustration. "Sierra, we need to talk." Her heart raced. She nodded slowly, unable to find words, her throat tight. Chris stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as his jaw tightened. "Darius shows up out of nowhere," he began, his voice rising slightly. "And now what? You knew about him, didn't you?" Sierra flinched at the accusation, confusion flashing across her face. What are you talking about?" He took another step closer, his gaze burning into her. "Don't play dumb, Sierra. You knew something about him, about who he is." Her chest tightened, her mind scrambling to make sense of his words. Chris, I don't understand," she stammered. Her pulse quickened, and she shook her head as though to ward off his meaning. "What are you saying?" Chris's expression hardened, his voice trembling with anger and something deeper, hurt. "I'm saying that he's my brother Sierra, and you didn't think I deserved to know?" The words hit her like a physical blow. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her mind spun, connecting dots that had remained disparate until this moment. Darius, with his piercing blue eyes so like Chris's, his uncanny ease within the house, his cryptic remarks, it all fell into place. But Chris didn't stop. His frustration boiled over as he pointed an accusatory finger at her. "You knew, didn't you? You knew something about this, and you didn't tell me." "No!" Sierra cried, shaking her head, her voice trembling with panic. "I didn't know that, Chris. I swear I didn't know he was your brother." "Then what did you know?" Christian demanded, stepping closer, his voice rising. "Because you're acting like there's something you're not telling me." Sierra froze, her stomach twisting painfully. Her breaths came faster, and her gaze dropped to the floor as the truth she had been hiding threatened to break free. "Chris," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "a few nights before we got married, She hesitated, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I slept with him." The words fell between them like a thunderclap. Chris stiffened, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" he said, his voice quiet and deadly. "What the hell are you talking about?" Sierra's eyes filled with tears as she stepped toward him. "I didn't know who he was, Chris. I didn't even know his name. I was scared about the wedding, about everything, and I made a mistake. A stupid, impulsive mistake." Chris's face twisted with a mix of shock, anger, and hurt. He took a step back, as if her confession had physically pushed him. "You slept with him," he repeated, his voice trembling. "With Darius, my brother." "I didn't know!" Sierra said desperately, her voice cracking. "I swear to you, I didn't know he was your brother. It was one night and it meant nothing." Christian turned away from her, pacing the room like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight. "So, what was it, Sierra? A way to figure out if I was good enough for you? Some last fling before you settled down?" "No!" Sierra cried, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I didn't know who I was or what I wanted, and I let myself make a mistake. But I chose you, Chris. I chose you because I love you." Chris spun around, his eyes blazing. "And now he's here," he spat. "He's here, acting like he belongs in my life and I'm supposed to accept him? How the hell am I supposed to do that knowing what you two did?" Before Sierra could respond, the sound of the front door opening drew their attention. Both turned as Darius stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He paused in the doorway, taking in the charged atmosphere. "Is this a bad time?" Darius asked, his voice calm but wary. Chris's anger reignited like a flame doused in gasoline. "What the hell are you doing here, Darius?" he snapped, pointing a finger at him. "You come into my life, claim to be my brother, and now you've turned everything upside down." Darius raised his hands in mock surrender, his tone steady. "I'm not here to fight, Chris. I'm not here to take anything from you. I told you that already. I don't want your inn. I don't want your life. I just want to be part of something real." Chris scoffed, his frustration bubbling over. "You think you can just show up and expect me to welcome you with open arms? You don't belong here. You're nothing to me." Darius's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I didn't ask for this either. I didn't ask to be your brother, or to show up in your life like this. But it's not about what I asked for. It's about the truth." His gaze softened, just a fraction, and he let out a breath. "I don't want to take anything from you, Chris. I just want a family. That's all I've ever wanted." Christian faltered, the raw honesty in Darius's voice cutting through the anger. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Finally, Chris let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. He looked away, his voice low and strained. "I don't know if I can do this, Darius. I don't know if I can forgive you for any of this. But," he hesitated, his voice softening, "you're my brother, and I guess that means something." Darius nodded slowly, his expression a mix of relief and understanding. "That's all I'm asking for, Chris. A chance." Sierra stood frozen, her chest tight as she watched the two men. The truth had come crashing down, shattering the fragile piece they had clung to, and now all she could do was wait and see what pieces remained. The inn was silent, save for the faint groan of the timbers under the weight of the storm. The golden light of the bedside lamp spilled over Sierra as she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the hem of her robe. Her mind raced, torn between the crushing guilt of her confession and the chaos of Chris's reaction. She could still feel the weight of his hurt, his anger. It clung to her like a second skin. Christian stood near the window, his arms crossed over his chest. The storm outside mirrored the one raging inside him, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff. He hadn't spoken since they left the living room. Sierra couldn't take the silence anymore. "Chris," she said softly, her voice trembling. He didn't turn. "Why now?" he asked, his voice flat but edged with emotion. "Why tell me about this now, after all this time?" "Because I didn't have a choice," she said, rising to her feet. She moved toward him, stopping just short of touching him. When Darius walked in that door, everything I buried came rushing back. I couldn't keep it hidden anymore. Not from you. Chris turned then, his eyes hard as they locked onto hers. You were going to keep it a secret forever, weren't you? If he hadn't shown up, you'd have never told me. Tears welled in Sierra's eyes as she nodded. I thought I was protecting us, Chris. I thought I could move past it, bury it, because it meant nothing to me. But I see now. I should have told you. I should have been honest. Chris exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. How the hell did it even happen, Sierra? How do you just, end up in bed with my brother? Sierra froze, the memory rushing back with startling clarity. She took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she began. It was the night after my bachelorette party. We'd gone to a bar downtown after the dinner, and I stayed late with a couple of friends. I was drunk, confused, terrified about what marrying you meant. Not because I didn't love you, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to be the person you needed me to be. Chris's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. So that's your excuse? You were drunk and scared? No, Sierra said quickly, shaking her head. It's not an excuse. It's the truth. I didn't know what I was doing, Chris. And then, she hesitated, swallowing hard. And then he was there. I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. He was just a man at the bar, a stranger who talked to me, made me feel seen. I don't even know what I thought. She turned away, her arms wrapping around herself. We went back to his place. It was impulsive and stupid and reckless, and I've hated myself for it ever since. Chris stared at her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And now you find out that stranger is my brother? Sierra nodded, her voice breaking. I didn't know, Chris. I swear to you, I didn't know until he walked into this house. And when he did, her voice cracked, and she wiped her tears away quickly. It was like the ground opened up beneath me. Chris let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. This is unbelievable. I don't even know how to process this, Sierra. I trusted you. I know, she whispered, stepping closer to him. And I broke that trust. I will spend the rest of my life trying to rebuild it if you'll let me. I love you, Chris. I've always loved you. That night wasn't about you. It wasn't about us. It was about me being scared and stupid and making a mistake I regret more than anything. For a moment, Christian didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, he met her gaze. His voice was low, raw. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sierra. Not for this. She reached for him then, her hands trembling as they rested on his chest. I know I've hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm yours, that I've always been yours. Chris's hands hovered near hers, uncertain. His expression softened, though the pain in his eyes didn't fade. How am I supposed to move past this? How am I supposed to look at you and not see him? Sierra stepped closer, her voice a desperate whisper. Then look at me now. Look at me here with you. I am not that person anymore, Chris. I am yours, and I'll spend every day proving it to you if you let me. Sierra pressed herself against Chris, her lips brushing his with a tentative plea. I'll wait, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'll wait as long as it takes for you to forgive me. Chris didn't respond with words. Instead, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. His lips captured hers in a kiss that wasn't gentle. It was raw, desperate, filled with all the anger, confusion, and love he didn't know how to put into words. Sierra gasped against his mouth, her fingers curling into his shirt, holding him as though he might slip away. Chris's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, the heat of his touch burning through the thin fabric of her robe. The kiss deepened, their breaths mingling, their bodies pressing together in a rhythm they hadn't shared in far too long. As his lips left hers and trailed down her jaw to her neck, Sierra's head fell back, her breath hitching at the sensation. Chris's hands moved with purpose, slipping beneath her robe and brushing over the curves of her hips. He pulled the fabric from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor in a whisper. Sierra reached for him, her hands trembling as she unbuttoned his shirt, pushing it off his shoulders. Her palms flattened against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. "Chris," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I love you. I've always loved you." Chris didn't answer with words. He captured her lips again, his hands tracing the curve of her back, pressing her body firmly against his. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. Lowering her onto the soft sheets, Christian hovered over her, his eyes locking onto hers. "You hurt me," he said, his voice raw and low. Chris kissed her again, slower this time, his lips moving over hers with a softness that belied the tension in his body. His hands roamed her skin, exploring her as though rediscovering her for the first time. He leaned down, his lips brushing over the hollow of her throat, the curve of her shoulder, the swell of her breast. Sierra arched beneath him, her body responding to his touch in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. Chris's hands slid lower, over the curve of her hips, gripping her thighs as he moved against her. Chris's name slipped from Sierra's lips in a gasp as his movements became more insistent. He responded with a growl, his lips capturing hers again, his body pressing into hers with a need that bordered on desperation. They moved together, the tension and hurt dissolving into something deeper, something primal and raw. Chris's hands framed her face as he kissed her again and again, as though he could pour every unspoken word, every ounce of love and frustration into that single act. When they finally came undone, it was with a shared cry, their bodies trembling in unison. Chris collapsed beside her, pulling her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her protectively. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of the wind against the windows and the slowing rhythm of their breaths. Sierra pressed her lips to Chris's chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns over his skin. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Chris pressed a kiss to her hair, his grip tightening around her. "We're not fixed," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But we'll get there." Sierra nodded, her eyes closing as she rested against him. In the quiet of the night, wrapped in each other's arms, they both dared to hope, for forgiveness, for healing, and for the chance to rebuild what they had almost lost. The Noel Inn radiated holiday charm as guests gathered around the living room. Strings of golden lights cast a warm glow over the rustic beams, and the scent of mulled wine and cinnamon cookies hung in the air. The chatter of guests filled the space, a lively symphony of holiday cheer. Darius stood near the fireplace, leaning against the mantel as he adjusted a log. The firelight played across his sharp features, emphasizing the strength in his jaw and the ease in his posture. The sleeves of his red shirt were pushed up, revealing strong, corded forearms dusted with soot from tending the fire. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on his skin, and every so often a guest or two would steal a lingering glance in his direction. None of them, however, were as bold as Mindy. "Now that's the kind of handyman I wouldn't mind on my payroll," she murmured under her breath, loud enough for Sierra to hear as she passed with a tray of appetizers. Sierra stopped, raising an eyebrow at her. "Don't even think about it, Mindy." "Oh, I'm way past thinking," Mindy replied with a sultry smile, already striding across the room toward her target. Darius glanced up as she approached, one eyebrow quirking in amused curiosity. He straightened, brushing his hands on a towel, and offered her a faint, knowing smile. "Can I help you with something?" Mindy tilted her head, her eyes unabashedly sweeping over him from head to toe. "I was just wondering if the fireplace needed anything else. You seem like a man who knows how to keep things hot." Darius chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "The fire's under control," he said smoothly, "but I appreciate the concern." Mindy stepped closer, invading his space without hesitation. She tilted her glass toward him, her lips curving into a seductive smile. "Oh, I'm not concerned about the fire. I'm more interested in the man who tamed it." Darius met her gaze, his smirk deepening. "You've got quite the way with words." "I've been told I'm persuasive," she purred, her voice dropping lower. "I've also been told I have a talent for recognizing hidden potential." He arched a brow, taking a deliberate sip of his wine. "Is that right?" "Absolutely," Mindy said, her tone practically dripping with suggestion. She reached out, plucking a stray piece of ash from his shirt. Her fingers lingered longer than necessary, her touch feather-light against his chest. "And you, Darius, have a lot of potential." Darius was leaning slightly closer. His voice dropped, smooth and teasing. "Are you always this forward, or am I just lucky tonight?" Mindy's lips quirked into a sly grin. "You're lucky. Very, very lucky." Their moment stretched, charged with unspoken promises. From across the room, Sierra's exasperated sigh broke the spell. "Mindy!" Sierra called, her voice sharp. "Could you give the handyman some space? He's actually supposed to be working." Mindy didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly, tossing a playful glance over her shoulder. "Oh, he's working all right. He just hasn't gotten to my wish list yet." Sierra groaned, setting down her tray and striding over to them. "I'm serious. Leave the man alone." Mindy winked at Darius, stepping back with exaggerated reluctance. "Fine, fine. But if you ever need a break from all this hard labor, you know where to find me." Darius chuckled softly, shaking his head as she sauntered off, her hips swaying deliberately. He turned to Sierra, who stood with her arms crossed, glaring after her friend. "She's got a lot of energy," he said, amusement lacing his voice. "She's got a lot of nerve," Sierra muttered, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Just don't let her distract you too much." "Yes, ma'am," Darius replied with a mock salute, earning a shake of her head as she walked away. By the time the clock struck midnight, the inn had settled into a comfortable quiet. The last of the guests had retired to their rooms, leaving the family alone by the fire. Christian, Sierra, and Darius sat together on the couch, glasses of wine in hand. Chris leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the sofa, his posture relaxed but not completely at ease. Sierra sat close beside him, her fingers brushing his thigh lightly, a subtle reminder of their connection, their resilience. Darius swirled the wine in his glass, his gaze fixed on the fire. The golden light flickered over his face, softening the hard edges. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice low but steady, "I've spent most of my life trying to figure out where I fit. Showing up here. It wasn't just about finding you, Chris. It was about finding all of you. This," he gestured to the tree, the warmth of the room. "I've never had anything like it, and I wanted to be part of it." Christian glanced at him, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, his voice quieter than usual. "You don't make things easy, Darius." Darius met his gaze, nodding. "I know." "But family isn't supposed to be easy," Christian added, a small, wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And I guess if we're going to figure this out, Christmas is as good a time as any to start." Darius's lips curved into a faint smile, one that carried more hope than amusement. He raised his glass, his voice thick with emotion. "To family." Chris hesitated, his hand tightening briefly on Sierra's. Then he lifted his glass. "To family," he echoed. Sierra smiled, her gaze flicking between them. She lifted her glass as well. "To new beginnings." The glasses clinked softly, the sound delicate against the backdrop of the crackling fire. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the inn in quiet serenity. It wasn't the perfect Christmas, but it was warm, real, and full of possibility. Thank you for joining us as Christian, Sierra, and Darius navigated the quiet halls of the Noel Inn and the long-buried secrets that surfaced amid the soft glow of holiday lights. Their story leaves us wondering, will honesty and understanding guide them toward a new beginning, or will old hurts and unanswered questions linger beneath the warmth of festive cheer? If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to Will I Be Happy for more heartfelt journeys that touch the soul. What do you think lies ahead for this family as they step into the next chapter of their lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember, Sometimes the answers are yours to imagine.